Hi, everyone. It's Janice, host of the Divorcing Religion podcast. Thanks for tuning into my show, whether you're joining me on audio or video. I've heard from some folks recently who have told me just how much the show has meant, and some of them have even found it not only to be life-changing, but life-saving, as they felt there was no one else who understood what they were going through, and they found the Divorcing Religion podcast, and they started feeling encouraged. Please help me keep my show on the air. Become a member by clicking the join button on the Conference on Religious Trauma YouTube channel. Thanks. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Divorcing Religion podcast. I'm your host, Janice Selby. I'm a registered professional counselor and a religious recovery consultant. My guest today is Erin Harrop. Erin is an assistant professor at the Graduate School of Social Work at the University of Denver, where their research centers eating disorders, weight stigma, and weight-inclusive approaches to healthcare. Their clinical practice involves supporting patients in recovery from eating disorders and pediatric mental health. As a person recovering from an eating disorder and religious fundamentalism, Erin hopes to help others heal their relationships with their bodies and hearts. Welcome, Erin.
Thanks so much for having me today.
I knew I wanted to have you on as soon as I heard you on my friend Brady Harden's podcast, The Life After, because I feel like weight and our obsession with weight, which of course, you know, there's disordered eatings of all different kinds. It's not talked about enough. Mm-hmm. And it's like the elephant in the room. And everything that we see in social media is kind of telling us all the time, you're not good enough. You could be better. You've got to be better. The one thing you're not allowed to be is satisfied with yourself the way you are. And that goes for all genders, but I do feel like girls and women, there's even additional pressure kind of put on them. So I'm really glad that you could join us today. And I was hoping you might start us off by telling us a little bit about your own childhood, and was religion a factor in your growing up?
Yeah. You know, last night as I was thinking about this podcast, I was thinking that religion was one of the main factors for me growing up. And if I were to start to describe my childhood, I would start by probably saying that I was the oldest of four and in a pastor's family, which were two of the kind of biggest influences, I think, for me as a young girl, kind of being in that oldest role, in that kind of set the example role, and then having that kind of magnified within a church setting of
life in the fishbowl.
Yes, absolutely. Like everything is on full display. And especially with our church, it was a small congregation. So it was definitely one where everyone knew everyone in the church. So we knew a lot about each other and each other's business. And yeah, I think culturally and kind of formatively, one of the other things that was pretty formative was that I was in a very liberal city. So I was growing up in Seattle, but I was also within a fairly conservative congregation that kind of was a shelter or kind of pod almost, that you will, so that all of that more worldly or normal, hear those air quotes, was kind of filtered through a fairly fundamentalist lens. And that fundamentalism was something that we were proud of. We kind of wore as a badge of honor, so to speak. We were taught to be proud of that difference and to kind of suspect other types of Christians or other people who used a Christian name as, you know, maybe not being real Christians or true Christians. So there was definitely some of those, what I now recognize as more fundamentalist tenets of, you know, we have a corner on the market on truth and interpretation and that type of thing. So I think my childhood was very much shaped by the church, and also by the culture of the 90s and early 2000s, which is when I was growing up as a young
Ooh,
girl and
shall we say
teenager.
purity culture?
Oh, I had a True Love Waits ring. I signed the pledge. I was kind of famous in my high school um, for those beliefs because it was very weird in my high school. So yeah, I wrote articles about it in the school newspaper, and
Wow.
it was I was very deeply immersed in purity culture. At 13, I read the book I Kissed Dating Goodbye and wanted, to begin courting and never date in my life. And yeah,
Wow.
it was an interesting time to be a kid for sure.
Right. And as the oldest, you were the prototype. So
Mhm.
there's so much pressure when you talk about growing up in a pastor's family, wherever you fall in the kid zone there. Being
Mhm.
in a pastor's family is just intense, the pressure that's there. But being the firstborn, oh my gosh. Yeah, that's just a lot to have to deal with. And so it was somewhat of a fundamentalist church. Was it the idea that all the everyone presenting as female had to wear a skirt or a dress?
Mhm.
Men were in charge.
So we did not have the requirement for dresses all the time, but we did have that. It was expected on Sundays that women would be in kind of dresses and skirts. And yeah, women were not permitted to have leadership roles above men in the church. So they were allowed to pray in front of men in some situations. So, like, for instance, in a Bible study, women could pray in front of men, but many of the Bible studies were kind of gender segregated. But women didn't lead communion. Women were not deacons. Women didn't have those types of leadership positions. They had, children's ministry, women's ministry, worship. So I think within the context, now that I've lived in Colorado and my wife is from Oklahoma and I've seen other communities, now I can see some of the more progressive elements of my church when I have something to compare it with. I would say within the kind of Seattle region, we were quite different. And I did have friends who were within more conservative aspects, who were within kind of the Bill Gothard
Mm-hmm.
whole school system and
Yeah.
adult education
Yeah.
system.
We
That
can
was
call it a
something I
cult.
attended very briefly
Right.
as a teen, but did not, thankfully, it didn't resonate
I'm so glad for you.
as much as it. Yeah. But one of
Yeah.
my best friends, that was her entire life and family. So
Mm-hmm.
it was close. And I was kind of the
Right.
weird radical. It was weird because with the Gothard folks, I was the weird radical Christian girl
Mm-hmm.
that was, allowed to wear shorts at summer camp, that kind of
Ooh,
thing.
you're a bad influence on those
Yes,
Gothard.
I was. I was. But then with my, with my other friends, I was kind of the lone Christian and the weirdo.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So it was an
Yeah.
interesting kind of place between cultures.
Right. And I think I recalled when you're chatting with Brady, was athleticism a part of your life? You did sports. How did that work being a girl? Like, was that an issue, or were all your siblings athletic, or?
Yeah. I think I was definitely like the jock of the family, probably. I was, and in terms of siblings, I have two sisters and a brother. So with yeah, I never had formal sports participation until I got to middle school. So up until then, almost all my sports were actually at church. So in our Awana club and in our youth group and those types of places. And actually, I think back now at how much running we did in our kids programs. And I had great endurance. So I joined the cross country team basketball team and volleyball team in middle school, played volleyball year round in high school, and then continued with volleyball intramurally and rugby when I got to college. So,
That's
and
a lot.
throughout that, also really loved weightlifting, was like a passion of mine. I loved being a strong girl. I loved trying to beat the boys. Um, so it was also intersected with some of the faith and religious elements in terms of like how I was told to like take care of my body, or like beliefs that we had about like women taking care of their bodies and being fit and those types of things. So it was kind of this mishmash of like I was encouraged in that way. I was encouraged to be strong and to compete with the boys, which I think is not something that all people growing up in that kind of religious culture had, to a certain point. And then it was like, at a certain point, we want you to be able to, not emasculate the boys. Maybe don't embarrass them by arm wrestling. It was like the rules started changing when I got to be 10, 11, 12. So, as a child, I think I was encouraged a bit more to be the strongest version of myself. And I think as I started going through that puberty process, it became a little bit more of like, I definitely got some distinct messages from a religious counselor that I saw at the time of, it's okay for you to be a jock and a tomboy as long as at the end of the day you can put on a nice dress and go out with your husband for a date and kind of be the good wife. Like that was kind of the messaging that I received around that. Along with how the church also influences message around food, fitness, women's bodies, those types of messages.
Yeah. Would you talk about that a little bit? Like why would the church be saying that they want the women to be fit?
Yeah. It was, some of my earliest memories with exercise are actually praise aerobics with women at the church. So we would have like this group of women over to our house with my mom, pastor's wife, and, in the basement of our house, like we would be doing these aerobics exercises to praise music, with different like coordinating motions.
Praise them higher, praise them higher.
Yeah. And for me at the time, like now looking back, I'm like, that's pretty weird. But at the time, everything was tied into church and everything was tied into faith. And so that wasn't weird to me at all. And, there was something about this kind of camaraderie of women, which was a little bit cool. But it was a camaraderie that was built around body hatred and body control. And so, the women that I was doing these exercises with, like they all either felt, quote unquote, felt fat, which fat is not a feeling. Fat might be a substitute word that we use for other feelings, like feeling a sense of disgust or shame or discomfort with our bodies. But these were women who, felt fat and had a desire for weight loss. And within our church, at least, like being fit and taking care of your body, eating the right foods, having a thin body, that was evidence of things like self-control, and, your ability to care for the temple of the Holy Spirit. So there was this kind of expectation that people in our church who are in larger bodies, especially women, I very rarely kind of heard those comments directed towards larger men in our congregation. But it did happen. That absolutely did happen. But there was this kind of push for women to take care of their temples, for them to control what they ate. The non-fat craze hit our church hard, and the women in our church hard. We had, families whose children were medically affected by not having enough fat intake in their diet as young children, because of this desire to kind of be healthy and be controlled and not give in to kind of these pleasures of the world, pleasures of the body. All of that was wrapped up in kind of this sense of sin being indulgent and delicious and enticing, whether that was in chocolate or porn. Then, you know, the godly Christian woman with a healthy relationship with God was someone who was well controlled in those aspects.
Yeah. Well, you know, one of my favorite sayings is that forbidden fruit makes the tastiest jam. And that's kind of what you're talking about with sin being so delicious. And I mean, let's not forget as well the idea that one in the church must be fit in order to continue having their husband be attracted to them.
Absolutely.
Like that's you, boy, oh boy, you don't, if he strays, it's your fault. If you've got extra weight, like that is just what I hear is a huge amount of pressure on girls and women. And then so you were encouraged to be the best you could until, you know, adolescence set in. And really it's everybody, when your body goes through changes, it feels awkward. It's awkward and we don't really like it. We can get, so I went through puberty at 10 years old, and it was like overnight, grown men who wouldn't have even looked at me before, you know, would be leaning on their car horn or yelling things out the window. I hadn't mentally and emotionally, I hadn't had a chance to process what was going on with my body, but something was different. And that's, we are so vulnerable in that time. And I really feel for children today and adolescents today, because social media wasn't a thing back then. We didn't even have Facebook. There was nothing. And now kids, there's just so much pressure. I heard something on the news this morning about children buying skincare products now. I'm like, what the hell is that about? That is just, it's just craziness. So yeah, a lot
there are
of pressure.
10-year-olds who can do better makeup than I ever could.
Yeah. Which, I mean, if that's a fun thing for them, I mean, knock yourself out. But we can't let it get lost that we are so much more than how we look. And this can really be such an issue for people, whether they've been in the church or not in the church. And sometimes I talk with them about, you know, well, what do you think would happen if you were in a car accident, if something changed significantly with your body, would you still think that you're a valuable person? You know, important things to consider when it feels like society's just becoming increasingly shallow.
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting dialectic to hold, how one of the messages within the church is that at all focusing on your appearance is pride and vanity and, you know, the things of this world. And at the same time, there's this focus on women's appearance of what it means to be and look like a godly woman. So like there's, I think, so many double binds. You know, we have to be, you know, pure and holy and modest. And we also have to have bodies that are significantly attractive enough to men that we can get a husband, which is like the ultimate Christian dream, you know, is a lovely, nice Christian boy or man, you know, like, so, yeah, it's, there's so many double binds, I think, that women and femmes experience within the church. And
oh my gosh. Yeah. When I think of the Proverbs 31 woman, I'm thinking she looks haggard. She got bags under her eyes. She's like, she's up at the crack of dawn. She's doing so much work. She's not going to be a beauty. Yeah. Oh my gosh.
Mhm.
Well, then how does that do you see then patriarchy and fundamentalism playing into potentially the development of disordered eating, or what do you feel comfortable sharing about your own journey then? So you were very fit and athletic, and then adolescence hits, and then what?
Yeah, well, for me, I think the disordered eating actually did start in childhood. So like that was like when I was going to like those praise aerobics groups and things like that. Even though I was in um, a thin and athletic body, and I clarify that because you can be athletic in a large body as well.
Hmm.
Look at the women's Olympic power team, for instance.
Yes.
So you can be a world class athlete and have a body that is much larger. But for me, I was in a small body, um, and that within my family was something that was pointed out somewhat regularly. The fact that I was uh, a thin child and that kind of thing. I was contrasted with some of my other siblings who were in
Oh,
larger bodies, and I heard my mom's dialogue about her own body and how she wished she looked like she did in high school, or
mhm.
what she thought about her thighs, or whether or not she thought she could wear a two-piece at the beach, and those types of things, which had a trickle down effect for me in terms of learning to fear fatness and learning to fear any kind of weight gain or growth as a child. Um, and really, with the way that my family interpreted it, they highly interpreted food with fat. That if you ate, you would get fat, or you couldn't have this. I can remember as a child, there were 3 different types of milk in the fridge. There was non-fat for mom and 2% for dad and whole milk for the babies. And so,
Wow.
I just started drinking non-fat milk because, that was the good thing to do. Right.
So
That
we
like,
equate it with virtue.
yeah. But, and the 2% that my dad had felt a little indulgent, but it felt like it was okay for him. Right. But because we weren't concerned about his body in the same way that we were concerned about my mom's body. And
Mm.
even though as a thin child, I didn't have reason to fear my body being larger, I learned those thoughts and behaviors from my mom's fear, from other women's fear in my life. And then it gets reified in the church. We had um, things like, one of my first largest starvation experiences was in youth group when we did the 30-hour famine. And every year I would challenge myself to go more than I did the last year. So I started with the 30 hours that we did,
Wow.
and this is this weird, like, now we look back and we're like, wow, like the white privilege, and the classism that comes through. But we would raise money for starving children around the world by starving ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
So we would get people to sponsor us for going without food. And I was always very good at it.
Hmm.
Um, uh, and, that was some of my first experiences with like longer periods of complete restriction, not having food. And I tied it then. So, it started with these little things of like choosing non-fat things, or having, certain foods. And I kind of gleaned information from magazines and TV reports and what people would talk about. And if I heard something, I adapted it into a rule. And I was really good at rules, and religion's really good at rules and lists of do's and don'ts. And
Mm-hmm.
so over time, that list of foods that were good got smaller and smaller. Um, and, at first I focused just on eliminating certain types of foods. And then it got down to, very rigid calorie limits that I had as a um, middle schooler with my cross country routines.
Mm.
And it evolved into, skipping meals entirely. And it very early on, I also experienced purging behaviors as well as compulsive exercise. So starting in middle school were when those behaviors started coming in. But it was all very tied to, like, how little can you go without? Like, how little can you survive on? And I think that's another teaching within the church about, like, how to live on little, and how to have what you need, but not more than that. Kind of these messages of what we deserve and what we don't deserve, and the danger of pleasure over indulgence. And so for me, it translated pretty seamlessly to a pretty serious disorder from a very young age. Now, as you know, as a counselor, looking back at the kind of level of behaviors that I had and the severity, you know, I started fasting once a week with a friend of mine for prayer reasons in seventh grade. But it was another way also of not having to confront my fear of food. By using.
Did your parents notice?
They didn't. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. So
I packed, you know, at that point in time, I packed my own lunch. I made my own breakfast. You know, I had dinner with the family, but there was a lot that I could get away with. And from their perspective, you know, they saw probably like a young, motivated athlete, you know, who's going out for runs and doing their weightlifting. And they were kind of unaware of my eating disorder for the first several years until midway through high school, when my sister told them about what she had noticed.
And then, so midway through high school, had you entered puberty? Because I know sometimes for folks who have smaller body habitus or are very athletic, they might have a later onset of puberty than those who aren't.
Yeah. So and that's kind of tied physiologically to, you have to have a certain level of body fat before a body can begin to menstruate. And so part of that, like, weight gain that we see right before people assigned female at birth begin to menstruate is like beginning to have, you know, the body habitus that can support that. So for me, I don't know if my onset was delayed. It may have been delayed a bit in terms of when I may have started without those disordered eating behaviors, but I did, you know, but right before my diagnosis as a sophomore in high school, I had a pretty precipitous drop in weight. And for me at the time, I was able to hide a lot of my weight loss with my muscle building. So I was a pretty high weight in a pretty small frame because of how much muscle I had and how much bodybuilding that I did during that time. But within my sophomore year, my intake dropped very dramatically. So I don't want to give a lot of numbers because they can be triggering, but very low amounts. And my purging increased and my exercise increased, and I ended up kind of dropping a lot of weight and having my friends notice that I was purging and not doing well, and those types of, you know, they noticed me going to the bathroom. They could tell at school that I was no longer eating. I became very afraid even of things like, you know, bites of apple, you know, I just had a tremendous fear of food. And so it was around that time that my sister also noticed, and my friends and my sister talked with my parents.
Wow, that is really something, that you had people who loved you and cared about you so much that they plucked up their courage to have an uncomfortable conversation. I'm just so grateful that you had people like that in your life. Now, did it have anything to do with, if you can remember, the changes in your body, like as you were, if you were starting more to reflect the onset of womanhood, and we know then that there can be these additional rules, this attention that's put on you even from within the church, and being pastor's daughter, now you have to be very careful what you wear and how you conduct
now
yourself.
You're dangerous.
Yes.
Yeah. I absolutely think there was an overlap with that. Now as I have grown and learned more about gender, I'm non-binary. And so I think many of the changes that I was experiencing in my body at that time, and I lean towards a little bit more mask presentation in my gender. And so at the time, being one in a place where there was only an understanding of binary gender, male and female, and where I was always like a little bit outside of that binary by being a jock and a tomboy and those types of things. And also being in my church, there weren't any other girls my age. So I was surrounded by boys all the time. For the year above me, my year, and the year below me, there weren't other girls. And so like I was kind of always surrounded by a bunch of rough and tumble boys, and I liked that, and it fit. But at a certain point, I stopped being one of the guys, and I started being, like a love interest kind of thing. And I think that transition was rough. And so like with my changing body, I had a lot more dysphoria about the parts of my body that were more feminized. I had always hated dresses from the time I was a kid. And so now to be like in a place where the dresses are not just like, I have to wear this annoying thing that makes it difficult to run and hang upside down on the monkey bars and all the things that I wanted, and climb trees, like all the things that I wanted to do. Now they were also problematic, not just because they were hard to move in, but also because I was sexualized in a way in dresses that I wasn't comfortable with. And there were absolutely comments in church about things that I wore. And it's interesting you bring up the puberty thing, because, where my body was developmentally versus where my younger sister's body was developmentally, we were about the same height and size, but we looked very different because of how our bodies were maturing. And so like we could wear exactly the same dress on different weeks, and if I wore the dress, people would complain that I was being too sexy or inappropriate with my clothing choice. But if my sister wore the dress, there was no comment made. Right. Like, and so it was very confusing because I didn't even want to be in the dress in the first place. And this is like, I kind of saw that as like, this is your fault. Like, if you're making me wear a dress, which I don't want to wear, the only time I ever wear it is on Sunday, then but then you're going to complain about how I look in the dress when my parents were fine with it when I left the house. I would never leave the house in something that my pastor father said, no, I don't think that's okay. Like if that never came up. But then
it's just creepy. It's creepy that
now I'm
adults
very
were looking at
out.
you and making that judgment call and sexualizing you, like you say.
At 11, 12, 13 years old.
Yeah. Unacceptable.
And that's, now I remember being just very confused at the time and feeling really helpless and also a bit defensive, because I knew what more provocative dressing looked like. I saw it every day, and that just was not me. I was one of the most modest, ashamed of my body kids that I knew. And so that disconnect was very strange for me.
Yeah. Well, and so then what happened when folks brought it to your parents' attention that something wasn't right with your eating? Did they take it seriously? Did they try and get you in for help? Or
yeah, I was so grateful, and I still have a a cross stitch on my wall from one of those friends who went to my parents and had the courage to have that conversation with them. And my parents did listen, and they took me to the doctor, I think the same week, got me into my pediatrician. I was one of the first patients that she diagnosed with anorexia. So I had a inexperienced pediatrician treating me.
Yeah.
At that point in time, our church did not offer medical insurance for the pastor. So our family was uninsured. So I started seeing a Christian therapist out of pocket to kind of deal with this, who was not experienced with eating disorders.
Oh dear.
And I saw, a nutritionist a couple of times who also was not experienced with eating disorders. And my doctor wasn't either. So my doctor kind of gave me a list of weights and said, when you get this low, you can't be in cross country anymore. And when you get this low, you can't go to school anymore. And when you get this low, you won't be able to walk around. And when you get this low, you have to be on bed rest. And so in my sick mind, I kind of thought of it as a to-do list,
Wow.
this is what I need to do in order to truly be sick and deserving of help. And until that point, I'm not sick enough. And that theme of I'm not sick enough is, it's one that is super prevalent within the eating disorders community. And I think it's also one that's echoed within some of our church communities in terms of sometimes who's deserving of care or who we're really worried about and that kind of thing. So yeah, even though I began getting treatment at that point in time, I wasn't monitored. It's really in the ways that I needed supports there. I wasn't refed in the way that I needed to be refed, because I didn't have people directing it who knew.
Right.
And because I was tricky and I lied and I cheated and I filled my supplements with water instead of Ensure, I was a smart, resourceful child. And at that point I was, the more you starve, the more depressed you get, the more hopeless you get, the more you think that death is your best option. And so I very quickly, in that kind of pseudo treatment, became quite suicidal, quite self-harming. And my eating disorder continued to kind of be at this difficult ongoing level for years into my young adulthood, when I was able to really get better treatment.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. So you really did suffer with the disordered eating through adolescence, and then even into young adulthood. That's such a burden to bear. And as you were talking about, essentially a checklist, a negative checklist, I just think, well, yeah, you were raised to be a Christian, a good Christian, the oldest child. You were raised to excel. So you were going to excel at disappearing yourself. And that's what it seems like with anorexia. It's like watching people disappear. It's such a heartbreaking thing. Heartbreaking for you, for everyone who loved you and watched you go through this. Was it ever addressed within the family? Like, did any therapist ever say, look, if this was the case, there are control issues, or there's that going on?
My therapist at the time was very, very convinced, and he was a pastor turned counselor. He was very convinced that my eating disorder was because of my relationship with my father. And I really pushed against that. And I still do. I don't think that, even today. I do think that overall patriarchy in general was a huge part of the development of my disorder. But if you were to ask me today, I would say it was much more about the diet culture of the time, the view of women's bodies at the time, and culture within culture and the church. My experiences of abuse as a child, which were not from within my family, but were from within the church, and how that taught me to have a sense of shame and disgust for my body, and a desire to punish, purify, and atone for that sin. Yeah, I think those would be what I would kind of boil it down to. But at the time, it was, my dad is a man of few words. And so I think people kind of locked into him being maybe less emotionally available or that kind of thing as what they thought was this trigger. And that was a harmful narrative for my family. It created more hurt. It created more distance then with my dad. It was quite hard because my sister, who knew about my eating disorder, she felt like she lost her best friend, and I never came back. My younger siblings were influenced by it as well. It created a tremendous financial hardship. My mom had to take on another job. There was a lot of ways that it influenced my family negatively. At a certain point, my parents were told that I was kind of a terminal case. And
wow.
that like, if I didn't choose to save my life, that nothing could. And so there was a lot of anger and pain and frustration at me for not just eating, and guilt and helplessness and sadness, profound grief that my parents felt at what they felt like was losing their child and losing the life that they had had. And when I was able to get more comprehensive treatment as a young adult, we did family therapy with everyone except my youngest sister, who was considered by the program to be too young to handle the things that I would be talking about.
All right. Yeah.
And then later, when she was a middle teenager, I did some therapy with her one-on-one in an attempt to kind of address our relationship and the issues that came up for her because of my eating disorder. So we've kind of addressed it in different ways over the years. But even like when I did get treatment as a young adult, I continued to struggle for another decade and a half. So I was in and out of treatment centers for a long time. But we did get some family intervention, especially at the first one.
Wow, way to face things. I think that's fantastic. Hearing how absolutely interested and invested your family was in your own healing and really wanting you to be healthy and to be well. And that also sometimes involves us taking a look at our own image, the image that society or the church or whatever has forced on us or force fed us of what does it mean to be healthy? What does it look like to be healthy? Because people can be healthy in a bigger body. People can be healthy in a smaller body. It's quite individual. It's not the one size fits all that the BMI and whatever else talks about. So I'm wondering then, now this has really become a central focus of your career, working with people who have some disordered eating habits. Do you see, are we having more young people present with disordered eating now, or are we just more aware of it? Is social media to blame? What's going on there?
Yes, to all of the above. I think in our studies, like we are showing an increase in disordered eating globally. And the US is definitely a part of that trend. And it's also one that's reflected across the world. I think to some degree, that's because we are measuring it a little bit better. We're still not measuring it well. Many of our measures that we have for kind of identifying people who are struggling with this still leave out people that don't fit this cookie cutter narrative of a thin white adolescent girl struggling with and her eating. And so like many of the tools, for instance, wouldn't ask somebody in a larger body if they were restricting what they were eating. Right. Because of the ways that the tools are set up. So that's what I mean when I say that our tools are not great, but they are better than they were, and they're more distributed. So I think we are identifying more. In the research that I've done, where I kind of specialize in eating disorders that kind of break the mold of what we expect. And so in my dissertation research, I talked to people in their 70s who had histories of disordered eating that went back to their childhood. And they were describing to me what they did in their PE classes in middle school when they were wearing girdles under their athletic outfit, whatever that was at that point in time. And, for especially the older folks that I have spoken with about their history of eating disorder and disordered eating, it followed the trends of the culture, right? So they grew up with grapefruit diets and like all of these different kind of cultural trends that, apple cider vinegar and these things that were kind of like hot items in different decades of our history. And for many people, they're either appearing like a quote normal kid, or them appearing in a larger body. It hid their struggle with food for years. And so from that angle, while I do think our body consciousness as a society has increased, especially with social media and, this idea that I could be watched at any time, that, if I post a photo, like it can go viral. If I, and I have spoken out in several kind of more public ways, sharing my story in publications that, reached 6.6 million people, for instance, in terms of reads. And when you're kind of under the microscope like that, like your body is then up for debate as to the legitimacy of your story. And so for me, having recovered as I've recovered my health and renourished my body, I grew into a fatter body, one that did not look like I was as a child. And now when people hear my story, when they see my picture, they say absolutely grotesque things about how I look and whether or not I'm lying about my history and my experiences and whether or not I have an eating disorder or if I should even go back to my eating disorder. That is what some people say. So it's, I think that like that lens and that hyper focus on bodies is something that we just see reflected everywhere. And I don't know how that could not impact our youth and adults. I mean, it's scary for adults sometimes to post pictures of themselves, even with just normal changes of aging.
I know. Yeah. And, I am quite close to my mom, who's in her 80s, like her middle 80s. And when she complains about her weight, it just guts me. So she never talked about her weight at all when I was growing up. And I tried to do the same with my kids, just not to talk about it or focus on it. But it's heartbreaking to me because part of me is like, oh my God, how old does a person have to get before this isn't an issue? Like you're 85 freaking years old. Eat what you want. Enjoy life. Like,
and it's
just have a great life.
It's healthier for people who are older to be heavier.
If we look at the BMI
curves with mortality, that it is healthier and protective in older age to be heavier.
Yeah.
And that's actually, it also is healthier and protective for patients with cardiovascular disease, with diabetes. There's an amazing meta-analysis of 154 studies that came out last year in 2023, with over 6.6 million people included in the meta-analysis. So they take all of the reviews, they put all of that data into the same calculator, and they calculate these correlations. And it really is, that review found that BMI was not associated with mortality in most clinical populations.
Wow. Wow. Well, when I think back over my own life, and so I remember the first time I dieted, I was 12. So my adolescence hit when I was 10, and body was really changing. 11. By the time I was 12, I realized I was too heavy. I was taller and shapelier than all my peers. I just had a growth spurt. So that's when the dieting started. And then, in adolescence, doing the Zone diet and Weight Watchers and Jenny Craig and Nutrisystem, and all sorts of stuff like that. And just how finally in my 50s, I read an interview with a comedian named Julia Sweeney. And I used to love watching her on Saturday Night Live. And she's also an atheist. And she said she gave herself the best birthday present when she turned 60. She said, I am never going to diet again. And I read that and I'm like, you are bang on, lady. I'm giving myself that same gift. I'm never going to diet again. And I see all the people around me doing keto, and now in the news every day is Ozempic, and I think people aren't recognizing the dangers of Ozempic. It can lead to all sorts of problems, but people are it's like the only thing they see, the only thing that's important. They want to leave a good looking corpse. Like they don't even care what it'll cost them. I'm going, people, for Pete's sake, come on.
Yeah. I won't dive too much into Ozempic. I don't need Novo Nordisk coming after me, but over 40 deaths have been linked with use of the drug. The long-term studies that we see is that it's one of those drugs that it suppresses appetite and eating when on it, and it's not one of those kind of long-term solutions. And when people are off of it, that can we do see that weight regain, which is what we see with virtually every type of attempts that we have to reduce people's weight. And what I hear from many people is that what's helpful to them about it is they say it, quote unquote, quiets the food noise, and from a therapeutic point of view, and from someone who works with eating disorders, often food noise is hunger. And it's the result of restriction. So often when we develop that kind of obsessive thinking about food, where we are constantly returning back to it, or we're trying to go to sleep and we can't go to sleep because we're hungry, or whatever it is, often that's coming from a place of restriction, right? So we haven't listened to our bodies and what our bodies need. And so the body turns up those neurobiological signals that say, no, you really need to eat now. And the more that you restrict, like those louder messages get louder and louder. They can get to the point where those messages kind of quiet. We see that in some really severe eating disorders. But for many people who are restricting, there's a constant voice in their head searching for food. And that's your survival, right? That is your body's survival. And so it makes me afraid, because as a therapist with some of these drugs, because for me, the best way of quieting food noise is to become attuned to my body's cues and what it needs, and to learn how to respond to them with what my body needs. And that attunement, that listening, that trust building connection between myself and my body, that quiets the food noise, because then my body doesn't have to yell at me when it's time for a meal. It can just say, it's lunchtime, right? But if I'm not listening, it gets louder and louder. So with something like this, where we're actually encouraging a disconnect from that intuition with our bodies and from our hunger, that like I have a lot of concerns about what that will be long term, for children, for people growing up with these types of drugs, because I really see it as antithetical to actually addressing the root problem that might be happening.
Right. Oh, yeah. And the feedback also that, pardon me, that we get from other people. So I never, ever had so many people compliment me and tell me how incredible I looked as when I was literally in the throes of grief. I had lost a really significant relationship. I could barely drag myself to work every day. I was only eating like a mandarin orange every day because I had no appetite. I was so devastated and heartbroken. And boy, oh boy, were the compliments ever flowing in about how great I looked. And I was like, wow, it's the grief diet. All it's costing me is the rest of my life. Like it was, and that's so sad as well. So teaching people to recognize when things are unhealthy.
Yeah, absolutely. I think as humans, and with our penchant for focusing on people's like physical forms and their bodies and that kind of thing, like we want to be encouraging to people. We want to say nice things to them. And if people have a change in weight, we want to automatically compliment that.
Right.
Because we see it in society as something that someone has done intentionally, with some kind of wellness journey or goal. And we want to reward that hard work and that dedication. And generally bodies are very resilient to deprivation. They strive very hard to retain the weight that they do. They make all kinds of cascading metabolic changes to defend your body's weight. And all of that with starvation, that initiates a whole slew of changes within the body to lower metabolism, to alter things like your body fat percentage, your muscle fat storage, all to try and defend this body weight that you have and its health, right? So that you have those reserves, so that you don't starve in a time of famine when you can only eat an orange a day. And so oftentimes when we see those weight changes or that dramatic weight loss, oftentimes it means that there's something that's not right within the body, whether that's a period of grief, a period of depression, a severe eating disorder, going through chemo, having a type 1 diabetes diagnosis. Like all of these are things that are linked with these kind of precipitous drops in weight. But in our culture, instead of learning to see that as a sign of something's changed, something might not be right for this person, we've come to see it as the ultimate dream, the goal, the glow up, the thing that you are most proud of. And I have had patients that say that the thing that they are most proud of in their entire life is their weight, and I can't imagine, I can absolutely, because of my anorexia, I can imagine getting to my deathbed and having that be the thing. But what a hollow existence to get there. And it's not actually a victory, right? And so, yeah, I see this all the time, and I encourage people not to talk about people's bodily changes or compliment someone on weight loss. You could be complimenting them on their depression and suicidality. You could be complimenting their eating disorder on their control, which is out of control. You could be complimenting them. I've had a friend who was complimented when she was going through chemo.
Oh, God.
Because that was the time when she lost weight. And and so at the end of the day, we just don't know. And so if you notice that kind of change in someone, instead of being like, oh, because people who are losing weight, they're getting reinforcement from everyone around them. And so if you have to say something about the weight, which is a big if, I encourage people to just ask hey, I'm worried about you. I've noticed some changes with your body. And sometimes that means that someone is struggling in some way or experiencing something that's really hard to deal with. And are you okay? right?
Yes. Oh,
Because
imagine.
otherwise you could reinforce that eating disorder. You could reinforce a really harmful diet regimen that
Mhm.
could turn into a eating disorder.
Oh, yeah.
Um, yeah,
Wow. There's a young woman on YouTube, I think Eugenia Cooney, and it's so she's obviously really struggling very significantly with anorexia, but she gets so much feedback, millions of people constantly commenting. It's like she won't feed herself food, but she's
mhm,
existing on
mhm.
all the things that people are telling her. It's so hard. I'm really grateful that there are people like you focusing on this and drawing awareness to it, and working with people in a gentle way, in a helpful
Mhm.
way, to bring them back kind of into reality, into a more real relationship with their body. You mentioned about wanting to help heal people's relationships with their
Mhm.
bodies and hearts. So, what does that mean when you're talking about their heart? Does that mean self compassion, appreciation, acceptance?
Absolutely. And it means connection too. So much within my story and other people's stories that I hear who are dealing with these disorders is like we become so disconnected from ourselves, and there are, like for me within the church, that disconnection was encouraged a certain degree because our heart was considered wicked and sinful and
Mm-hmm.
dangerous. Our
Mm-hmm.
bodies were considered wicked and sinful and dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
And so there was this kind of desire going back, all the way to mind body dualism to kind of elevate the spiritual and the intellectual and like demean like our fleshy existence, like our embodied existence. And so for me, so much of my healing journey has been about like reconnecting, they call it, the soft animal body that you have, right? Like reconnecting to my soft animal body, learning how to listen to my body, trying not to view my body as other or an object, which is so hard within patriarchy. Because it's a
Mm-hmm.
project, right?
Mm-hmm.
My body
Mm-hmm.
is a project and an object to be improved. And
Right.
like
Wow.
starting to view my body as a companion, as someone who has been with me through everything, and I have had some faithful friends who have been there by my side, but my body has experienced it with me and been with me through every dark, alone moment and has never let me down,
Mm,
you know?
mhm,
And I've let my body down and I've hurt my body. I've starved my body. I've inflicted pain on my
mhm,
body,
mhm.
you know? And so I think like the self-compassion for me comes in defeating that shame,
Oh,
that
yeah.
shame, which is like at the core again. And it is tied in with like, if we're born sinful, if we are born, you know, into evilness that must be controlled, like the
Mm,
heart of us is gross and shameful. And if the
wow.
only good that is in us is God and not even us,
Mhm.
right?
Wow.
That's a pretty like shameful, miserable existence. And
Yeah,
so the
absolutely.
self-compassion has come in with, starting to see myself as a child, right? Like when I was worried about like saving the world from hell at 5 years old.
Mhm.
I would cry at night thinking of all
Mm,
the people that I knew that were going to hell because of me,
yeah.
because I had not told them about Jesus, And so like starting to feel compassion for that little girl who had the best
Mhm.
of intentions and a beautiful heart, um, and who at 5 felt like she had to do sit-ups,
Oh, gosh.
and who at 8, I have a picture that I keep with me in one of my journals. They know this is connected to self-compassion, but which was one of the first pictures that I got at school. So I was in 3rd grade and I was wearing one of these like 80s. It was like a combination. I don't even know what to call the outfit, but it was like the top was sewed to the bottom in like shorts with a skirt that went on top of it. It was all like neon athletic fabric, like turquoise and magenta. And, very comfortable to run around in, and, no one's going to see your underwear and make fun of you, that kind of thing. And that was like what I was wearing on the day that I was student of the week or whatever. And every student in 3rd grade got to be student of the week 1 week, right?
Nice.
And they would put your little picture up there and they'd put a piece of work that you did next to it. And when I got that picture, I just felt so much shame because I thought I was gigantic. Like I thought I was so large and I thought my body was so shameful. And looking back at this picture now, I just see a normal, nerdy little kid with some questionable outfit choices. But beyond that, like I was just a little kid, and so like reconnecting with some of these parts of myself and knowing that at 3rd grade, I was changing how I was eating. I was changing how I was exercising. And I felt so much shame that I never let my mom see that picture. I didn't bring it home. I crumpled it up and I have it and it's still crumpled. But now I'm glad I kept it because now I know, and at the time I kept it because I wanted to remind myself of how bad it could get. Which is ludicrous because I was probably about, I don't know how much a 3rd grader weighs, but, you're well under 100 pounds as a 3rd grader. You are a little petite thing. Or at least I shouldn't say that. There are 3rd graders who are large. I was a little petite thing. Right. And so, I don't know, like looking at that now and like, I can have compassion, like, wow, like you were worried about like saving the world from damnation. Like, and you were taking on responsibility for other people's eternal damnation. And, like there was a good heart. There's a good heart there. There was a heart there that wanted to do the very best for other people, that wanted to be the best kid I could be.
Right.
And, so I don't know, I think like starting to develop more realistic views, to whatever extent I can.
Yes. And I
retell those stories differently.
Right. Yes. With a different filter, your perception of it now, you have such a better view of things now, farther down the road. A couple weeks ago, I interviewed therapist named Dorian Ortega, and she uses the letters FLY in her therapy, which she calls radical therapy. FLY standing for first love yourself. And I feel like that is a big part of what you're doing and what you're talking about. It's a revolution to learn to love and accept ourselves, whatever our condition, whatever shape we are in, physically, financially, emotionally. That self-compassion is imperative. And actually, I see we're coming to the end of our time here. And you had shared with me a piece of writing that you did recently, a poem kind of reflecting back on your life, these different times. And I was hoping you would share that with us.
Yeah, I'd love to. I'd have to pull it up real quick, but this was a poem that I wrote for a Dharma talk. So I'm a part of a meditation community it's really quite lovely because I've worked with these folks or like meditated with these folks since 2009. So at this point, it's been a decade and a half that I've worked with some of these teachers. And for me, meditation was a catalyst in my journey, and it took me to a place that therapy didn't quite reach. And it helped me examine how I related to myself in my mind, like in a very transformative way. And within Buddhist practice, we talk about the teaching as Dharma. Okay. So that's a word you'll hear in this poem. And we also talk about kind of one of the eternal truths of existence being that there are things in life which are difficult to bear, which we call dukkha.
Okay.
And that how we relate to that dukkha, how we relate to suffering, it can change. That the dukkha is always here, but how we relate to it doesn't have to be the same way. And if we can learn to welcome and accept the dukkha, the suffering, those things that are hard to bear, that they become more bearable. And so anyway, this poem was about the Buddhist quality called karuna, which is a concept that kind of encompasses compassion, self-compassion, and care. And within Buddhist thought, we're often thinking about a quality, not just towards, like we think about it towards different people. Like we might think about what care looks like towards a stranger, towards a friend, towards a lover, towards ourselves, towards the earth.
Okay.
And then we might think about these things similarly with compassion. So, this was a poem about karuna, compassion, self-compassion, and care. They say that compassion is born from a knowledge of dukkha, of suffering, of that which is hard to bear. As we sit with pain, suffering, and all that is hard to bear, the dukkha changes, or perhaps it is more how I relate to it. I sit with dukkha like an old friend welcomed into a dinner party. Perhaps this was not the friend I most wanted to come. I may have even missed their invitation, maybe on purpose. But I have learned to welcome them in all the same, ask their name, invite them in, take their coat. Is there anything else I can do to relieve more of the burden? It seems you have been carrying too much, old friend. I am weary just looking at you. Dukkha has softly knocked upon my door many times with familiar faces and new. Each time she arrives, though I know to expect her, I feel a bit of surprise, a jolt. Dear friend, I know you well, but I haven't seen you in so long. This dukkha is new but familiar, like all dukkha, perhaps. Over the years, I have ushered in strangers, lovers, children, and friends. Today, as I open the door, I recognize her well. My, how you have changed. The last time I saw you, I thought you were much older. You sounded so mature. Everyone always told me that, and it made me a bit uncomfortable. But now, in front of me, she stands, just 11 or 12. Her plain, oversized, hand-me-down clothes conceal the slight curves that I know are forming beneath the long, baggy shorts that cling to her hips, and the men's large t-shirt that hides a plain white training bra. Do you know how hard it is to find a plain white training bra with no pink and no bows and no flowers, no colors, lace, or designs? I insisted on the plain white to avoid any hint of temptation to seduction, since men at the church had complained about how I flaunted my body in the long homemade blue calico Patty Woodlawn dress when I led them to sin. I wondered then how I could flaunt something which held so much shame. Now I wonder how a father could hear those words and take them in as a gentle rebuke for him and his daughter, and not seethe. Maybe he did. I hope so. She accepted the onus of their sin like she accepted their eyes hanging off of the points on her body, the hands lingering on her waist as they ushered her into church, like she accepted their spiritual leadership and their rebukes when she dared to say she felt uncomfortable and repented for questioning their motives. She accepted this onus and so much more naturally as was her place. Women's bodies were sensual, dangerous, and she was almost a woman, 11, and had already arrived. Today, as I usher her over to the couch, their hands like disembodied ghosts cling to her small frame. Above my couch, there is a drawing of a small girl in a blue dress. The girl is surrounded by an image of a woman's naked body covered by hands that are on fire. But the little girl has a sword. Today, as I usher her to the couch, she eyes me a bit warily. Would she even recognize me? Would she be ashamed of how I've grown up? A brief wave of grief washes over me, and I grab us both 2 cozy hoodies. I am certain I make her nervous with my tattoos and my Buddha statue littered with crystals. I smile shyly and apologize. Sorry about the sign. It says grateful for you fuckers. She giggles, brushing it off, trying to sound older than she is. She waits quietly. So who's on the KCMS top 20 list this week? Please tell me it's not Avalon again, I ask. Her countenance alights. Contemporary Christian rock has this effect on her. All of a sudden, I'm lost in a sea of nostalgia as she regales me with how Mercy Me was still at the top of the charts, totally undeserved, and can we be done with that song already? But Point of Grace's album was also still on the charts. Phew. And had I heard of Jennifer Knapp? Like 5 of her songs from Kansas are on the radio right now, and one of them just broke the top 10. Mm-hmm. As I listen, the ghostly hands seem to fade, falling like ashes around her. Noticing the slowly accumulating mess, she blushes and looks down, apologizing for getting dirt on the couch. Erin, I interrupt her quickly. This is not your mess, I say firmly. She stares, not quite comprehending. Nonchalantly, I begin sweeping the ashes into a little pile, as I've done so many times before, and gently place them in the candle that I keep on my altar. The candle is called grief. Dusting off my hands, I note how the smudges of ash imprint on my skin. A tear runs down my face. Now let me show you my sword collection.
Ah, so beautiful, so powerful. Thank you for sharing such an intimate poem. I think it's going to touch a lot of people who've tuned in to our show today. If people want to get a hold of you, is there a way that they can find you? I know that you'll share with me some links for the show notes, anything you feel important related to our topic.
Yeah. So I can share with you my email as well. It's erin.harrop@du.edu. And I can link my faculty bio, which is not very much online because I don't have a website yet, but I hold what I call community office hours once a month for folks where anyone who wants to talk about the things that I'm interested in and I research, so religiosity, eating disorders, body size, those types of things. I host those on the 3rd Friday of the month. So you can always email me and ask for that link and just feel free to join. That's just something I do to connect with people in my community who are curious and want to connect around this topic. And you can also find me on Facebook. And I do, for if there are listeners who are in larger bodies and struggling with eating disorders, I admin a very small, not very active group called Recovery at Large for people who have recovered in larger bodies and are dealing with the kind of intersecting stigmas of having an eating disorder and being considered larger by society. So I'm happy to, you can look it up on Facebook and request to be a member, or contact me some other way and I can get you connected.
Thank you so much for the important work that you're doing and for giving so much time to chat with me today. Really appreciate it. And I'll let you know when our episode is going to drop. Thanks a lot, Erin.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone, for tuning in and joining us today. Please take care. We'll see you again soon.